we have to always announce if everyone can please put their cell phones off or on silent mode. Anyone's cell phone ringing, you will be asked to leave. I'm delighted that I think I can say my colleagues from the McKinsey Global Institute, since I have been involved with them since 2010, I think, as a senior advisor. But of course, I'm not responsible for anything they do. I tell them what they should or shouldn't do, but whether they listen to me, since I've only been an advisor in my life, most of the time people don't listen to me. But I have to say, as an introduction, before I introduce the speakers, that I've actually learned a lot from McKinsey Global Institute, because they do things differently from most of the rest of us. It's not to say that they're right, but they're certainly interesting in opening one's mind to many different things happening in the world. And among other things they do is to look into the future. Of course, often they get it wrong. But they do look into the future much more, I think, than most other, and they're very daring about it. And so the subject for today, from poverty to empowerment, is of that genre. They're really looking to the future on how you go from poverty to environment, along with all the issues to do with sustainability and SDGs put together, and growth. So it's not the case that they're either talking about SDGs or talking about climate change or sustainability. They're talking about all of that together. Let me now introduce them. This Sven Smith is a senior partner at McKinsey. That is the actual consulting company, and the current chair of the McKinsey Global Institute. Actually, the first time I did have any contact with the MGI was along with Montek Ahluwalia back, I think Montek was at 2000, I think it was, when we were involved in their growth study.
Yeah.
I think it was 2000, I think. So that's the first time we were together in that particular activity. So Sven is a senior partner and chair of McKinsey Global Institute. And he also chairs the Insights and Ecosystems work. And he's a current member of the whole firm, not just the MGI, the whole firm's global leadership team, which is called the Shareholders Council, which oversees the firm's knowledge development. Maybe later on you can tell us what that means, overseeing the firm's knowledge development. And of course, being with McKinsey, he works with leading companies to develop strategies for growth and serves all industries, analyzing the success factors required for business growth and examining, and this is again what the MGI does for them, the way mega trends influence growth and how the world is going. He has been associated with the ideas behind the strategy beyond the hockey stick, people, probability, and big moves to beat the odds. That was 2018. And the granularity of growth, how to identify the sources of growth and the drive enduring company performance. 2 books that he co-authored. And as chair of MGI, he leads research and authors MGI reports on global economic trends and topics such as productivity and growth. And it was really productivity and growth with which MGI started, as far as I understand. Urbanization, innovation and technology, labor markets, the future of work, emerging markets, and also Europe's economic outlook. He holds a degree in mechanical engineering and an MBA, but he doesn't have a PhD. Being a research institute, I have
tough meeting today.
Yeah. Being a research institute, I have to make that distinction for the chairman of a global institute. Sven has worked in measurement and control as an engineer and a researcher. And he's also involved in the Netherlands, his home country, and is committed to a better future for the Netherlands. Sven, if it's for do it for the whole world, not just the Netherlands, a better future. Yeah. And then my colleague Anu Madgavkar is a partner in the McKinsey Global Institute, and she leads global research focused on labor markets, human capital, technologies, economic impact, gender economics, digital financial inclusion, and inclusive growth. She also led research efforts focused on India's economic growth, labor market, and digital economy, mostly assisted by Shishir Gupta, who is now with us sitting there. Anu was previously based in Mumbai, where she co-led McKinsey's financial institutions work in India, and she's served a range of clients, of course, the top-tier global banks, Indian state-owned banks, capital markets and infrastructure-focused financial institutions across the portfolio mix, organization of product market strategy and wealth management, wholesale banking, life insurance, and retail banking. Anu then has lost her way, and she's moved off to New Jersey. New Jersey, for God's sake.
We agree with that.
From Mumbai to New Jersey. So I don't know what's happened to her, but she moved to New Jersey. But this is basically she could do it because of all this Zoom. Otherwise, I don't think she could have done that. So having said all that, let me now, who's going first? Sven, if you go from poverty to environment. I have been sort of peripherally involved in this, so I know roughly what they're going to say. I often didn't like the numbers, but go ahead.
Thank you, Rakesh. I think this PhD is the knockout for the presentation, but I'm also not an economist, as you heard from that long resume talk. It's a privilege to be here among researchers. Again, no PhD, but I do research. I spend a lot of time on it. I think the one angle, maybe to Rakesh's point of what we try to do at MGI, is to hold the test. What we do is it from micro to macro. So not macroeconomists, we're trying to figure out what does a company do? What do 100 companies do? What do 1,000 companies do? And if you add it up, does that actually add up to what the economy does in macro? We had one famous moment that maybe, Rakesh, we were also involved in the productivity and growth work. Robert Solo was involved because we need to actually have real PhDs help us. And we were doing the cost curve of the steel industry. So the supply side, the supply curve. And we had every single steel plant in the world on there with full cash cost and fully integrated cost with the real numbers. And he got into tears and he said, can you actually do that? Because for him, this was two mathematical lines, upward sloping, non-upward sloping, convex, non-convex, and God knows what. So mathematical. And he literally said, oh, that's really how it works. And said, yes. And then here's the demand and that's the price. And we're only 1 cent off per ton. And so this is so that's what we try to do. So say, from that back up. So for the work that we want to focus on today is, you might strange things. It's about sustainable inclusive growth. And then we talk about from poverty and empowerment on the title. And why do we say this? Because we talk here about economic inclusion, not all the other inclusion factors that you could also talk about, but broad-based economic inclusion across the world and society. And what we're suggesting here in this work is that it's superior to do the work across growth, economic inclusion, and sustainability at the same time, rather than in silos. And that the answer is fundamentally different if you do it that way than if you do it in silos. Let me give you 2 or 3 examples, and then we'll just get into the depth of it a little bit with me and Anu. The first point I want to make is if you were to only solve for the climate change energy transition, you would do it at any cost. You say it's apocalypse, any cost, let's do it. And then you basically get the global north to say to the global south, why don't you do it tomorrow? And the global south doesn't have the money and it doesn't work. You would also maybe do the expensive first because it goes with higher volume instead of the cheap first if you were to do a silo optimization. And what we're suggesting in this work is if you want to have sustainable inclusive growth, the transition has to be affordable. But the other point is people need to actually get richer. Because when people have the money, they can pay for the transition. And I'll make this very personal. So strangely, in the 60s, the GDP per capita in my country was the GDP per capita of China today. You could at that point not swim in the Rhine. because it was dirty. Because at that time, we could not pay for a clean Rhine. That's why the Yellow River had all its colors as China was getting richer. Now China is rich enough for the Yellow River to get clean. And that's a holistic way of thinking about these three parameters. So with that, maybe I go into one. There's a clicker on. Here it is. Okay, very good. So we're suggesting that we need to solve for two opportunities or problems, whatever you want to call these, in parallel, and that actually there's some urgency to think about 2030, even though you work towards 2050. The crunch of this entire stuff is the next decade. Very simple. If you don't do it the next decade, it's not going to happen. What you don't start never finishes. But if you do very little the next decade, you'll never meet these goals that are out there. Now, we can have a long debate how close we can get to these goals, but we think you need to not only solve the energy and land use systems problems of energy transition at zero, but you also need to solve that an entire generation of people can live up to a much higher line of livelihoods, which we call the empowerment line, which I'll spend a little bit of time on soon. So to this point of that we want to solve economic inclusion and transition at the same time, you also do that while there is growth. And what we suggest, there's three little arrows, but in an article that we wrote 2 years ago, there's basically 15 very fundamental arrows between these three. In the West, there's a bit of hesitance on growth because people say, with growth comes more footprint, so we shouldn't do it. I mean, carbon footprint or environmental footprint. However, growth also produces money with which you can pay the transition, which is my Rhine problem in the 60s. If the transition is very expensive, as I said, then the economic inclusion gets bitten. If you keep a very low bar for economic inclusion, you might do a good net zero transition, but you keep everybody poor. So you have to not only solve the problem, as you set the goals for all three. And so we are suggesting that you can sort of solve this as an and you should solve it as an and. And yes, there are some balancing acts that we will try to make transparent in this discussion. So the first point we wanted to show, and I'm sure this will immediately jump to controversy and so on, but we all grew up with the $1 poverty line. Some of them in the world, if you ask them what is a poverty line, they will still quote the $1, although the World Bank has brought this to $2.15. And here in India, I don't need to say, but it's useful to repeat when you're in the West, that for that you kind of spend $1 on food and $1 on the rest. And by the way, food means you still have famines. At the poverty line, food is not so rich. We believe that for typical low and middle income countries, the floor, call it Africa, India, Latin America, many places, should move to 12. That's not we only. The World Bank has done work on this. The IMF has done work. You might have done work on this that I haven't read. But for that, you see that there is a step up in food from 1 to 4. This is purchasing power equivalents. Then you get shelter, you get a little bit of discretionary spending. And the difference in the human life between subsistence food at the poverty line and having access to all these four at this level is that the people become empowered. And why do we use that word? Living wages is a good term, but that just says you can live. Empowered means that you're at the level that you can start being participant in society and that you can live up to the potential that is in you because you have the education, you have the health, you have the... By the way, at 12, it's still pretty basic. Yes, it's not, but it's a lot better than 2. And we think that when we solve sustainable inclusive growth, we can't just say it's against the poverty line. There's many, many reasons. Not that many people, it's still 700 million, but not that many people live below it. But also, it's just not the right line. So if you solve this equation, and then you might say, okay, why is that for a rich country much higher? That has to do with the cost of living structure in the richer country. But just think about the 2 to 12 as the main shift, because that's 90% of the people that we want to raise the bar for is from that 2 to 12. There are many people say, well, what has McKinsey to do with an empowerment line, isn't that the World Bank, type kind of work, development, economy? Where's the micro to macro in that? Well, first of all, this is a micro consumer spending pattern, which basically they're going to buy with businesses. That means these businesses need to produce affordable products so that they actually can meet the needs at this level. And 50 to 60%, as Anna will show shortly, of this puzzle is solved by business-led growth. And so if businesses don't satisfy this condition in their living wages, which, by the way, the living wage standard is not that far off from that $12 that multinationals are starting to hold themselves on all across the world. So if you think about that, that's a huge shift in that three-part framework of sustainable inclusive growth. And Anno is now going to show you the parts that maybe we'll solve already and the parts that are still a gap. If we want to solve sustainable inclusive growth with the net zero bar that we already know, what does growth do? What does this $12 do? And then, we'll come back with a little bit of more. Yeah.
Thank you, Sven. Just one announcement that this is embargoed. Everything, you got these papers here, so on. This is embargoed till 11:30 a.m. tomorrow, when they will release it formally in the B20.
Yes.
Right? So please, this is a very privileged preview. So please keep it to yourself till 11:30. It is being recorded, and once they have released it, we will also put this on our website, the recording of it. Yep.
Thanks, Rakesh. So to pick up where Sven left off, with the empowerment threshold defined based on the $2 going to $12 and then higher for higher income countries, if you look at the distribution of population across all of these countries, we find that roughly 60% of the global population today has consumption levels that are below this threshold. And they're not all the same. So the layer right at the bottom, the roughly 10%, roughly 850 million people, are at less than 20% of the empowerment threshold for their respective countries. And in most countries, these people would be considered in extreme poverty. But even above those people, there are another 4 billion odd, 4.7 billion totally, who are well below this threshold of consumption that's needed. So that's kind of one of the gaps or challenges that this research delves into. What would it take, what would it cost, or what would it take to raise the spending levels and the spending power of this 61% of the global population up to the required level over a 10-year period? But on the right-hand side, you see the other gap. The other gap is really focusing on the net zero transition. And here what it says is that we will need spending of various kinds. We really focus on spending around low emissions assets and technologies across a variety of sectors around the world. And that spending in total over the same 10-year period would be about $55 trillion cumulative for the 10-year period. And this is not including the high emissions investment that will also continue in different parts of the world. But the 55 trillion alone is a large amount, and it represents something like a 41 trillion step up relative to the investment level in low emission spending that's already happening in 2020, that we can assume goes forward at the same level all those 10 years. So $55 trillion in total across, the bulk of that is actually in power and mobility, but there are 7 sectors across which this accrues. So when you translate both these two numbers into economic gaps, you think about from an economic standpoint, what amount of resources need to be channeled to fill these gaps. On the empowerment side, that's a cumulative of $37 trillion. Again, over a 10-year period, it's about 3.7 trillion per year over this period to raise everyone to that level. And as I said, on the net zero side, it's about 41 trillion of incremental spending on low emissions technologies. If you add up these two, that's 8% on a combined share of GDP basis, 8% each year over a 10-year period towards shifts in consumption, shifts in spending and investment required to meet both these gaps. And the regional composition of this matters. On the empowerment side, more than half of this actually comes from sub-Saharan Africa, India, and other Asia. On the net zero side, You have large shares that come from the US and the EU, the more developed countries that have larger emissions footprints to start with. But even there, the global south, so to speak, so developing countries would account for almost half of the net zero gap. So this is one of the linkages that Sven alluded to, that for the global south, for developing countries, it's two kinds of gaps or two kinds of challenges that they have to confront pretty much at the same time. When you think about this as share of GDP, I talked about an 8% combined share of global GDP each year. That's 4% roughly on either side, but it varies a lot by region. For most advanced parts of the world, it's the net zero gap which is larger. It's 3 to 4% of GDP annually for the US or Western Europe, for example. In developing countries, this can be as high as 6 to 7% of GDP. For India, these numbers are about 13% of GDP on each side. So it's a large gap. And for sub-Saharan Africa in particular, the empowerment gap is very high and might even warrant thinking about a ranged level for how far can you actually get, because the gap is actually very high from where they are today. So there's a lot of regional variation. But the good news is that all told, when we look at the potential that growth and business-led innovation has to address or fill these gaps, that's very sizable. Growth and business innovation together can address and fill maybe half of the combined gap. On the empowerment side, the value is much more. About 65% of this gap can be bridged by protecting what we call baseline growth expectations, which is the projected growth under normal conditions that we're looking to country by country and for the world. And the rest really by accelerating that growth by capturing productivity growth opportunities by sector in each of these countries. So 2/3 of the global empowerment gap can be bridged on this basis. And on the net zero side, about 40% can be bridged through growth, but also through technological innovation that brings down the cost of these low emissions technologies. So the good news is that not all of the gap can be addressed, but a sizable chunk can be. How does this actually work? On the empowerment side, the big lever is higher incomes that come with growth, but crucially, the fact that growth can enable more jobs to be created in productive sectors, in productive occupations, and upskilling workers to move into those jobs is the channel through which incomes can rise and consumption rises as a result. On the net zero side, what growth does is it expands the dollars of investment capacity that these economies have to spend on things like electric vehicles or renewable power. So there's a 25% increase in investment capacity. But beyond that, what growth does is it spurs the reductions in technologies that would make, in our estimates, about $10 trillion of investment in the money. By in the money, we mean cost competitive relative to fossil fuel technologies after adjusting for market risk and technology risk. And when options become cost competitive, the switch into those is easier and actually makes sense. And we think there's $10 trillion worth of that can come on stream in a vibrant and fast-growing business-led environment. So growth can fuel both transitions. But as I said, it doesn't go all the way. So there's an unfilled or residual gap on both sides. And its effects are also quite different based on the region that you might be in. For the faster growing economies, particularly in Asia, particularly India and China, for example, the combination of baseline and accelerated growth can do a lot to close most of the empowerment gap, whereas it's harder for countries that are growing more slowly. On the net zero side, the impact is more even. Across most regions, growth can take you about 1/3 of the way or 40% of the way, but leaving a sizable portion of the gap still unfilled. So that was sort of the good news or the expectations around what growth can do. We acknowledge that we have about $13 trillion of empowerment gap and $26 trillion of net zero transition gap still to be addressed. So the questions really are, what are the options available for societies to think about how those gaps can be bridged?
Just to clarify, these are up to 2030. Right?
These are for 10-year periods,
not 20.
2020 to 2030.
Not
Yeah.
2050. That's what
No, with the logic that if you make this transition work over this period, it sets you up well for the 2050 timeframe. So the ultimate goal is 2050, but the investments need to be made at this point. So there are some real questions about the residual gap and some real choices that societies and economies would need to make in terms of how far to go on those and how to finance them. For empowerment, we talked about a $13 trillion cumulative gap. We think that there's $3 trillion or so a chunk of this, which could come through the lever of making affordable goods and services available, mapped to all the essential needs that go into the empowerment line. So if you think about housing, health, food, education, how can the costs of these things come down linked to real productivity improvements in these sectors? And there's a public role and a private role to be played here. It's not possibly market forces alone, but intelligent deployment of public support in areas that then make housing or healthcare affordable, for example. But it's possible based on this micro assessment that says that real productivity gains are available. And if we harness them and pass them on, that's $3 trillion of opportunity that goes towards filling the empowerment gap that's available out there. And for the rest, then, it's really a question of how much societies want to commit in terms of additional public support to things like direct transfers, or other ways to subsidize cost of living for people who live below the empowerment line. On the net zero side, there is again the question of the $26 trillion here. You'll see that portion shaded in gray, which was the unfilled gap that growth and innovation alone may not be able to address. Here again, we see a role, and we've broken this down into a large number of investment opportunities by sector and technology, but there's a big role for public capital to step in and create blended finance solutions that can improve the economics of these investment opportunities and crowd in more private capital. So there is a potential pathway. We paint this as a scenario. The consequences of stepping up public finance commitments to the extent that we are describing here are uncharted. So they will have consequences back to the baseline economy. But we do paint this as a scenario to consider and for societies to think about that and make a choice on a more informed basis. When you look at the net zero, this is a map of sources of potential capital on the left-hand side, and then the end-use sectors and technologies where capital investment will be needed on the right-hand side. And what's clear is that the sources which are public in nature, which include grants, concessions, state-owned enterprises, have the potential to flow into every end-use sector. And particularly in the power sector, they do have, there are large opportunities where public capital can come in and have that crowding in effect that then spurs more private investment. So there are a set of, very granular, very detailed opportunities here. But as I said, the consequences of actually doing this are quite unknown and uncertain at this point. What we do know is the following, right? Which is that just based on harnessing the forces of growth and innovation, historic progress is possible. We look at this by class of region, but even globally, 600 million people could exit extreme poverty. 2 billion or 2.1 billion people could actually attain the level of consumption we're talking about in the empowerment line, and $10 trillion to address 50 gigatons of carbon abatement could also come on stream. So all of this is possible. Beyond that, if you think about the societal commitments or the public capital commitments that are consistent with that full scenario we painted, that would be about 2% of global GDP on an annual basis. So it's a large shift, and again, it's regionally very uneven. So the needs of lower income and middle income economies will be higher, and there are real questions about how much of that can be committed. Notwithstanding that, focusing on the growth and innovation piece is one of the big takeaways, I think, of the work from our standpoint.
So make a few closing remarks.
Thank you. Thank you, Anu. Thank you very much.
So I think you sort of saw the full depth of the problem now. And you might say, why does McKinsey even write a report that doesn't solve it all? And I think the most important point that we actually want to do with the work is that the world asks itself the right question. The right question is not the energy transition alone, it's not growth alone, it's not economic inclusion alone, it's all three at the same time. And the answer is going to be different if you think about all three at the same time. In the places where I live, the Western world, there's hesitance about growth. It's tentative. We're tentative about growth because basically growth leads to more footprint. But if you do the full analysis that Anu just shared, is additional growth creates so much more additional financing capacity. It's easier to solve the transition with growth than without growth. Now, in India, this might not be a question, but a large amount of money in this world will have to come from the Western world. And if there's hesitance on growth on that, it's a problem. So if you ask the right question, you're going to have a couple of shifts that are on these pages. Instead of scattered, siloed solutions for sustainability, for growth, and for economic inclusion, where, for example, in economic inclusion, you will do a lot of development economics. Let's bring the schools, but not the growth. That doesn't work. A farmer in Africa is going to only send their kids to school. Farming families only going to send their kids to school when they have the money and the capacity to send them away. Then it's good the school stands there, but it's not true that if you build the schools, they will come. They actually need to have the growth to free themselves and have the capacity to live that. So that interaction just works everywhere, and the problem solves differently. This notion that we only focus on extreme poverty, which is only 700 million people instead of the 4.8 billion people that Anu talked about, is a big shift in trying to solve the problems for the world and the opportunity for people. Net zero at any cost will bite the empowerment, and so on. So that is another thing which puts the urgency on the transition to go cheaper. And we're currently not doing the cheapest things first. There are three cheap things: heat leakage or cold leakage, methane leakage, and food waste, which are behavioral, which we don't address as much as wind and solar. But they are, and everything that has to do with efficiency of energy consumption is just cheaper. You would want more of that first to get there. And again, since business-led innovation can drive a lot of this solution, there should be a lot of focus on, call it, deregulating those sectors so that they can do it. Why is there such a big permitting discussion in the environmental space? Because if you can't, even if you want to build the new plant, but you can't do it because it's not allowed by permitting, we're not going to get there either. So you need to unleash the business-led growth also on the regulatory side, so that, like I can go this through every segment of energy, or you can do this, and the same thing again for the empowerment. And so this joint solution is for us the right question, and we full well acknowledge, and we think the world should acknowledge, that by business-led innovation, with all the preconditions I already gave, which is going to be incredibly hard work, we only have solved half. And it's an interesting question when you ask society to solve something that's not solved, whether you are going to try to acknowledge that and then change the problem solving, or you're hiding it. At the moment, I think the gap is hidden. This half gap that we can't solve on empowerment yet with purely business-led innovation, what you would have as a societal response is, yes, just up the regulation, we'll tell them to go do it then. But if that cost then becomes a burden, that will eat the empowerment again. And over time, people will become resistant, because if what you do is not recognizing that you're somewhere moving the costs around into the spending bucket of the empowered consumer, they at some point will revolt against these policies because they were not told the truth of how much it is that we're taking on. And we hope that this work with that says we need to solve it across the three elements, not siloed. And that this work changes the question. And we know that when humanity has the right question, sustainable inclusive growth, with the bar for poverty at empowerment, we will get closer to a good answer for society than if we just solve it one by one. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sven. I think you got a bit of a flavor of the approach of the MGI as at the beginning, really connecting the micro to the macro, which we often don't do. And of course, they have their own particular way of doing it, which is really very absorbing and interesting. And the other thing I would say is that one thing that is very characteristic of MGI is they work across geographies very easily. And the teamwork is so you have teams in different places, and the teamwork is amazing, and that's how they are able to do all this number crunching that you've seen. So, Lavish, can I ask you to do your comments from up here? And let me just, for benefit of our guests, if not for CSEP people, Lavish has done a lot of work on many different areas, but prior to becoming president, he was really coordinating or leading our climate change work. But he did a lot of work on livelihoods, financial inclusion, and many other issues. One thing maybe you don't know is that when he got his PhD in economics from Boston, he got the best thesis award, which was in international economics. He's become much more domesticated ever since.
Domesticated.
And of course, he's now our president.
Thank you, Dr. Mohan. It's really nice to be here and to actually listen to a full-scale McKinsey presentation. I have long admired your work and the capacity to be able to bring up amazingly disaggregated, multidimensional things into a common, coherent framework. And you do the same here. It's really nice to be able to see that up here. Yeah. It's also really nice to see those amazing graphs that you make. And I've always wondered and felt quite jealous, really, of not being able to do that. And some of those graphs, I get so mesmerized, I actually can't see the numbers. But as a result, I'm not going to talk about the numbers. There is a problem. We understand all the basic issues, and I think you do a great job of putting together the fact that economic growth is a component of an inherent component of the transition process, and of course, for both sustainability and equity purposes. You do that, and you do that well with a lot of numbers. And frankly, I don't know why anyone would not agree with your numbers, because it's very difficult to agree or disagree with numbers in this space. There are so many numbers floating around. It's very difficult to get a good grip unless we are able to unpack each and every one of them. And of course, that's difficult to do. So there's that part. But I was quite taken in by this point about that for empowerment, roughly similar to our overall SDG goals, roughly not the same. The investment requirements are similar to those for roughly what I call mitigation. That's quite a surprising one for me. I never realized that it would be similar. But then I start to ask the question, where is resilience here? Where is adaptation? I would have thought that they should be a part of empowerment, because you really cannot sustain these the kind of benefits that you're talking about without those kind of investments going under there. I'm not sure what you have done, because I don't really have the report. But if you, I'm assuming you did not add those investments there. I just going with that assumption. My guess is if you were to, the empowerment figures would way overwhelm those for mitigation. Just a thought, and it leads to some other ramification. I'm not going to go that. Perhaps it's something to think about as we go further. The second really striking part of your work was the focus on innovation, and absolutely rightly so. However, the path from innovation to surplus, that chain, is really not necessarily straightforward. Innovation may not be productivity enhancing. Productivity enhancements may not lead to surpluses. Of course, there are many interrelationships in that whole chain, but the most important one, I feel, is that of prices. And surprisingly, you haven't addressed the pricing issue in this. It may not have been directly linked to some of the points being made here, but to me, it stands at the base of everything. And of course, with price, there are also the non-price kind of interventions and so on. Perhaps for simplicity and lucidity, you left that whole domain out. But my guess is, I feel that prices lie at the base of whatever we will go ahead. We need to do. So those are the two key, thoughts that arose while I was looking at this. But then I started to, of course, and like any good piece of work, I think it does generate some thought. And I just started to just think about 3 points, and I'm going to very quickly go with them. First, we are not going to get any global any substantial global cooperation in the next few years. And if that is not going to happen, then the question is there a non-cooperative solution at all in the short term towards this? And I'll come to that point a bit later. The second part, the point here, is to do with, it's fairly clear where the funds could potentially come from. It's also fairly clear, you don't talk about it, but given the macroeconomic conditions in many countries, at least from the public side, those funds are not going to come in. And given all the externality arguments, etc., we are not, a realistic assessment would today say those funds are not going to come up in the next 10 years. So then the question is that what could change that could make this whole system work? And there is the third point that I'd like to add, and that essentially has to do with innovation, but a very specific kind of innovation. Innovation that leads to low cost processes in, of course, energy, in storage, in carbon storage and sequestration, in healthcare, in education, and so on. So we have to quickly shift from whatever the costs are right now to a low-cost economy, and that, to me, is the only way this whole thing is going to be possible. And what then that says is that perhaps the key critical investment here is not adaptation and not mitigation and so on, but actually it is on R&D. Just some thoughts that emerge, which I thought is something for all of us to think about as we go forward. There's a last part here. It's a small one, but I thought it's something that just came up. There is no gender in your empowerment thing. But, gender obviously it goes across all of those items that you have there. So I completely agree with that. But I feel that we all know how a gender focus leads us to greater bang for the buck, even on each of those empowerment elements. So whether it is inclusion, which you call savings, or I think financial savings you call it, or it is communication, or it is, of course, education, health, etc., etc. A gender focus can lead to far greater returns than otherwise. So that essentially, I think, is my 10 minutes. Thank you, Dr. Mohan.
Thank you very much, Lavish, for very, very thoughtful and analytical remarks, which I hope that we'll get the chance for you to respond to.
Absolutely.
Now, if I'm going to ask Renu Kohli. Renu Kohli is now a senior fellow with us. She has been a long-time researcher and practitioner, experience on mostly macroeconomic policy issues. That covers lots of sins. She's worked with the RBI, then many institutions, starting with that's the International Monetary Fund, Institute of Economic Growth, and ICRIA before landing here. A lot of work has been focused on the financial sector, liberalization, capital flows, and exchange rate management in emerging markets, with, of course, a special focus in India. And with us more recently, she's doing, in some sense, a macro and climate change and pricing and non-pricing issues to do with mitigation. Renu.
Thank you. Is this on? Okay. Yeah, thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the presentation of the report. It was certainly, as Lavish said and Dr. Mohan said, very thought-provoking and absorbing, actually, and huge amount of work, very broad area, and then to distill it into, down to the brass tacks, it's an enormous effort. And it did provoke a lot of thought in me. First of all, my immediate reaction was that okay, here's another concept of economic empowerment, and it adds to all those multiple, besides the poverty lines, the multiple, multi-dimensional poverty index, then the, concept of inclusive growth itself, and then all the things. So, so many other objectives, and all noble objectives, so hard to disagree with them. But there is a difference, which is, as you said, it's all connected. And the closest parallel I thought was perhaps with many of these models which have modeled how to approach to reach the net zero, make the net zero transition in the low carbon scenario. And these models, at least some that I'm familiar with, are integrating all of it together. Investment requirements, the certain GDP growth rate is assumed, and it is distilled into sectors. Investment, of course, shifts from carbon, high carbon to low carbon, and therefore, given the employment elasticities, assumptions over there, jobs shift and all that. So I think that's the closest parallel. I also found that I think the starting baseline of $12 per day is close to the threshold level of entry into the upper income, middle income group. So from the lower middle income. So in a sense, it's reframing the poverty thing. And so you add, instead of 700 million, you add 4 billion more. So you get this number 4.7. So one of the things is that it'll keep the multilateral agencies like the World Bank busy and, with a lot of developmental work to do, because that's the trajectory of the poverty lines. The thresholds has continuously been raised. So the number of poor has never really fallen, if at all. So, okay. But moving from that, there are some specific comments, especially about the numbers. I'm curious as to why 2020 has been taken as a starting point. It makes sense to have it as a threshold for a decade, but 2020 is hugely abnormal in all regards, especially with the enormous amount of GDP contractions in all parts of the world. And then it is linked to the fact that some number which struck me was that 90% of investment in 2020 was public, in the public sector, and 20% of the consumption was by way of transfers. So from the public side. So, that means a huge depression in both investment and consumption. And starting from that base point, then to have these huge spring and bounce in investments and public spending, it seems very, very over optimistic to me, although I do not know the mechanics too much in detail. The next is that I saw the baseline assumptions, which is 2.7% growth annual real GDP. I'm wondering whether what it does, because a third of your world economy looks set to be contracting, which is China. And so 2.7% might not be very realistic. But however, these numbers are always like that. I'm also not very convinced about the increase in, closely matching the point that Lavish made on innovation and driving productivity, because the last 2-3 decades particularly show us that there has been innovation, tech, but aggregate productivity has actually systematically gone down, whereas inequality has risen. So how do we achieve? Because the concept of inclusive growth has been there at least since 2000 and I think 1 or 2. Then there was this growth report again by the World Bank. Then the G20 also adopted that inclusive growth, sustainability, etc. It hasn't come about. So that's, I'm sorry to be, So the sources of this increased productivity I saw is not cost savings as much, but innovation and new businesses and new job creations, whereas the experience in the last 2 decades has been the converse. So that's where I think that there is a lot of optimism as to why, the question I had in mind was that why should we assume that this time is going to be different, considering that, so much of investment is in the public investment domain. So much of consumption itself is subsidized. If that support wasn't there, consumption would be so much more depressed, and therefore demand overall, the economy itself in the world would be so much depressed. So, that's the large. In the baseline, at least for India, I find 7% optimistic, although that seems to be the Yeah, filling in the gaps, how to reach the frontier. There are three main things which are the source of reaching the frontier I think, which is efficiency improvements. Interestingly, the sector that you talk of efficiency improvements is construction. And all over the world, I mean, construction is the low productivity and one of the least productive sectors, and it's very hard to achieve productivity improvement in that. So that is again another point. Second is work arrangements, and I assume that is jobs and or more efficient ways of operating, and then direct support to reach the front. So there's a huge dependency on transfers, which is okay. There, most of the net zero carbon pathways, which are looking at the impacts upon GDP and employment, also assume a lot of transfer. So that props up consumption apart from the income growth. What will it take to get to net zero? Public support is about 20% of it. Another 21%, I think, comes from private crowding in sector, private investment crowding in effect, and private in transfers money, 10%. Now, I'm not sure about this bit about, which is, I think, on the investment side, is it? And then savings from efficient learning. I'm not so comfortable. I think if I remember correctly, this 10% was coming from consumer finance, etc. So that's private borrowing. So that's a lot of consumption support, I mean, smoothing, which is increase in debt. And given that the starting point, even now, today, it's 2024, 23, debt levels are so high in all the countries. And so, including India and, all over the world, debt levels are very high. So their bandwidth for all this is very narrow, I would say. Will have the society. I think that's about completes it. And specifically for India, the need for public support to get onto this net zero 50% and the GDP. Your number is, which was quite interesting, was that the India's need for public support to get to net zero is 50% larger or higher than the current social spending shares at now, which is a lot. And again, I don't think that it's likely to happen. But in terms of course, framing the debate and triggering a discourse, which is also extremely important part of provoking thoughts and discussion. So that's all from my end.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Once again, it's very thoughtful, analytical points. Before I ask you to give some comment, then we'll throw it open to the audience. I just have one question, which is that you're talking about an increase of overall investment, right, for both net zero and for SDG, effectively. It also implies that savings have to come from somewhere, globally, I'm saying. And to the extent that the world is aging, and that the surplus savings, which the last 20 years have been coming from China, are not likely to come. So where will all these excess savings come from?
Yeah. So what we thought is we'll split the answers a little bit. Maybe a little bit I'll give your answers, and it's just in the sequence that we were thinking about it. I'll just give one general comment about the two reactions, which I found very thoughtful. Is the one thing we were afraid and are afraid about this report, because we have had testing reactions from advisors and so on, is that this is too pessimistic because it's not solving the problem. Yeah, because there's a 50% gap. And what I hear from both of you is you're too optimistic because you're not having this, not having that. And I could very much lean into that thought too, that there is what this actually frames is like with ambitious assumptions on growth, and with ambitious assumptions on investment and innovation rates, you can get to this level, and then there's still a gap that would also have to require ambitious levels of public support. And I think we're actually wanting to lay out that we cannot hide this discussion anymore, because otherwise we will run into a different train wreck. And let me give you an example of that on innovation to David's question. Did I pronounce that right? We are very much on the innovation side that should be happening. That's why the IRA is actually a better implementation at the moment than what is forced regulation to deploy. There's two kinds of regulations that you can do. One regulation is I tell you by that date, this has to happen. And if you don't meet it, you can't sell your product anymore. And by that regulation, you force deployment of whatever the then available technology is, but you're not accelerating the curve of innovation. Whereas the way that
This is the Inflation Reduction Act.
the Inflation Reduction Act is constructed in a way, we will subsidize your price that you keep investing and you're upping the R&D, which has actually happened already globally because the innovation money has now shifted to the US and the innovation investments. We believe there should be enormous amount of work to rather even delay some of the deployment and use that money to make the future cheaper to make this possible. And we are doing the numbers actually ahead of COP28 on that, so it's not that I have them fully. But if every dollar you deploy at the wrong price in the next decade, instead of deploying towards R&D to make the future 2 decades cheaper, might be suboptimal. And so we are very optimistic on the R&D side if we actually do it. And then you can have the whole debate, can we do it? But the learning curves in solar have been enormous. The learning curves in wind have been enormous. Even on batteries, the learning curves are not horrible, and so on. So if those learning curves continue at least, but we might have to open nuclear too. I mean, many other things need to go on. But the money towards, the more you force deployment, because you say it's urgent, you then end up to not spending the R&D because the money goes to the. So that's maybe one area. You then mentioned the notion of not mentioning price. Price can be, of course, one way to stimulate innovation, but price is also a way to destroy empowerment. So the question is where we did the price. So what we did deliberately in this work, which in most other work does not happen, is to not already input a carbon price. We said, this is the investment, this is what it takes, and we're going to say, this is what companies will do at market prices. And then this is the gap that's left, which you then can implement with a carbon price, you can implement with other mechanisms, and we can have all our own views of what the best one is. But most models that you read have it somewhere implicit, the price already in, which basically tells you the consumer is paying, which means the empowerment is not happening. So we wanted to take that clean. But I understand that for that final gap, so we believe for the non-final gap, so the pre-public support gap, you could do it without a carbon price. That's how this is calculated. For the remaining, you could put a carbon price, but every bit of carbon price deployed would hit the last point on low cost. Everything this says is we need to get innovation to lower price. I believe that is lots of incentives in R&D, but it's also deregulation. Part of the cost is permitting. Part of the cost is, if you think about nuclear, there's an enormous chunk of the cost is permitting. It takes so long to build one because of when you get the permit. Nobody's going to take that risk. And so there's many, many other places where that's the case. But this focus on low-cost solutions is anywhere. I think, by the way, the low-cost solutions, but also the lower cost of production exist, these possibilities. And the question is, are we creating a regulatory incentive system that produces that outcome, both in the labor market, in the R&D subsidies, maybe, or in the R&D credits, or whatever you do, to actually focus on the low-cost innovation. Low-cost housing exists. It's called production homes. That are 50 to 100 to 70% cheaper than homes today for the same square meter size. But there's the permitting rights and other things are actually in the way of getting them out as much as other reasons. So I think there's lots of innovation to this question in that area. But again, we are fully with you. This is not at all an easy exercise. This will happen tomorrow. Even what we write down, we think is challenging, but we should have the debate on the real challenge and not on just moving the ball forward and see where the train ends, because it might be on the rails or off the rails. Right?
Yeah, I just want to echo Sven in thanking Lavish and Renu for your comments, very thoughtful, and I think have sort of hit many of the issues that we ourselves have been thinking through as we did the research. And then to build on Sven's responses, maybe I'll address Rakesh's question first, which is perhaps we should have even clarified this upfront, that when we're talking about the empowerment gap, that's actually a consumption spending gap. So that's not the investments required to build all of the infrastructure or other things that will support empowerment. It is just the sheer gap in spending or consumption that these households or individuals have, and how that should be bridged. So from that standpoint, it's not, it should get financed through income and then surpluses and transfers, as opposed to being funded by savings. On the net zero side, it's a combination of capex investment and what in economic data would be classified more as spending. So when an individual buys an EV car, for example, or an EV two-wheeler, that's not necessarily capex, that's consumption dollars that go into that. So it's a combination of both those things. But there, because we are looking only at the low emissions part of the overall envelope, there's actually investment dollars shifting out of high emission, because for all these countries, there's a high emission trajectory which either plateaus. In developing countries, it continues to grow, but in more advanced economies, it's either plateauing or coming down. So there's a shift of resources that take place from high to low, which is part of the reason why the overall macro question of savings and investment is colored by the shift, as opposed to incrementally thinking about this as purely new investment.
So, sorry, just to clarify. So you're saying that the overall investment level does not have to increase?
No, a little bit, but not
A little bit, but
not the full 8%.
Nowhere, nowhere near. So that was on that question. Then I think coming to Renu, your comments, Sven addressed most of Lavish's comments, but coming to your comments. Yeah. I think, first of all, we would agree that the numbers we put out are not predictions or projections. What they represent is based on the understanding of the micro and the best performance levels that we've actually seen across sectors or countries or technologies at a micro level. If you scale that up, this would be the realm of possibility. And that's really what we're painting. So to give you an example on all of the affordable services piece, construction, let's take affordable housing, for instance. What we did is to look at the actual rates of construction sector productivity improvements across maybe 20 to 30 countries over time, and then to group them into different cohorts based on, initial low construction productivity, but then some other countries have high construction productivity. So the improvements that you can expect would be different based on your starting point. And then we took the best performing level of improvement in each such cohort and said, well, what would it look like if other countries were able to match this? So it's very much in that spirit of saying, let's look at empirically what has been the best for a set of peer, let's say, countries or regions. And if scaling that can get you so far, then that's what we took into our model as a frontier of possibility, if you can call it that. And then similarly for work arrangements, so there are two parts to how the labor income increases and helps to pay for empowerment. There's one part which is just the structural transition that happens when workers move into better, more productive jobs and sectors. And that's kind of one part of the puzzle. But we found that in the advanced economies, though there is scope for that to happen, what has actually happened is that labor's share of national income has actually been declining steadily. So we benchmarked countries where they have the social contract or the overall approach to wage setting and so on, such that their labor share has been kind of more stable. It hasn't declined so much. And then we asked ourselves, well, how much could that contribute if other countries also manage to improve work arrangements so that labor share can actually stabilize? So that's a little bit of the thought process that went into saying what's possible as opposed to predicting that this is going to happen because in the past it has happened. It has not happened. And what makes it different now is, I think to Sven's point, raising this bar and asking the right question of saying, this is a legitimate aspiration. We have to think about these aspirations alongside with net zero and what would it take? And where should societies put their might or consensus build to say that these are the areas in which we want to work together, public and private, come together, whether it's paying a better living wage or setting work arrangements better or cooperating to make affordable housing come on stream. Lavish, you made the point around pricing, that all productivity gains may not be passed on as pricing benefits to consumers, and that's absolutely right. But that's why we put that in the bucket of public and private action. because something has to happen either by way of regulations or nudges or some form of concessions, for example, that then make this viable so that that amount of gain can get passed on to the consumer. And that's why we think about the whole affordability piece in that bucket.
Maybe just one little thing, and then we should go over to your Q&A, Rakesh. I think what maybe the contrast here is also the current system is pursuing ESG, SDG goals by who screams the loudest. I'm a little black and white now because there's so many. As a company, you can't do them all. I'm just talking to lots of executives. You can't satisfy all SDGs at the same time at the same date. So they are reacting to maybe what they can do best. They're maybe reacting to where the pressure is the highest. But the world is doing the same thing, which is, there's this agenda, there's that agenda, and they just negotiate by pressure and economics. But they don't, there is no sort of integrated sense of, well, this is at least pursuable with all the caveats. It's pursuable, and then we can debate how far we go, with a gap, and not asking people to act against something that's not there. Because you can't give a group of people a goal without let's, for example, say the public support of the final gap. If that public gap is not solved, we are going to reach, with stretched assumptions, half of it, not full of it. Okay, so let's have that discussion. And then we can say, well, we don't have the money for that last step of public support. Okay, then we will have to also be a little less ambitious. Maybe come back to your point that on the energy and climate, we might have to do more on adaptation and resilience than just mitigation, which is one of the things we are doing work on in the transition work. What part of this would you do adaptation-wise? At the moment, the adaptation discussion is not completed at all. I'm not sure, but if you do work on it, we should collaborate. But I think it's a question that is not part in full of the mix and could be one of the economic levers to make this whole thing a little cheaper.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sven. On adaptation and mitigation, just some comment I've been making all the time is that basically it's only about 20 countries that really need to do mitigation. All the other 180 countries, it doesn't matter what they do to the world. They matter to them to a certain extent. And therefore, for them, it's almost all adaptation.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And even the international MDBs don't pay enough attention to this. Okay, so Daljit, something after that?
Yeah. First, I want to thank you for an excellent study. And what I really liked is the integration. You take an integrated look at inclusion, growth, and dealing with climate change. So I thought that was really good. The one concern that I do have is that the whole conversation has been about money. And it's how, the investment and so on. And it reinforces this view that if you throw enough money at a problem, you'll solve it. And I think it doesn't look enough. I realize it's hard to look at other things because what you've looked at is comprehensive, in that part of it. So I understand the difficulty, but I think it's important to look at those institutional issues. And just to give you an example, in India, we don't have any entity that is responsible for an integrated strategy to deal just with climate change. And now we want to put in growth and empowerment. So that's, or you look at the US. The IRA, I think, is great. But the big problem they're going to have is siting transmission lines. And they do recognize it. But siting is a state level issue. And they're having lots of trouble. And given the political divisions in that country, it's going to be difficult. So I thought it would be, I think these issues and basically the point is, how do we do it? And I think that's just as important as how do we get the money to do it. Thanks.
Thank you, Tajid. Sandhya, we'll
Yeah.
take 3 questions at a time.
Okay, very quickly. Thank you very much. That was really interesting. I have a question, a clarification, and a comment. So the clarification is in the empowerment discussion, in defining the threshold, the $12, there were several elements that constituted that. Housing, education, nutrition, health, etc. And I wondered what assumptions were made. Some of these are binary, like clean drinking water. Either you have it or you don't, right? I mean, it can't be cleanish. But in terms of education, nutrition, health, there is a continuum. So what are we talking about, right? Is it primary education? Is it higher education? So that was the clarification. The comment was, where does equity come into this? Because as we talk of innovation, who will have access to innovation? If you're talking of innovation driving growth, who has access to innovation? And that, in a sense, leads back to the question of being able to access education, etc. And equity then becomes a very big question then. So in a sense, it sort of, it echoes the question that Lavish raised on gender, but there could be other equity issues beyond gender as well. Thanks.
Yep. Thanks. Shishir, are you on a roll on that row?
Yeah, we've done that row.
So, thanks, Anu. So good to see you. And Sven, nice to see you. Couple of things, right? One is I want to build on what Sven said, right? That there was a bit of hesitation in coming out with a report which says part of the solution is not fulfilled, right? And that I think is very satisfying to me, because I think one of the things that I used to at least think when I was on the other side, that how are we saying everything is solved if we do XYZ, right? I mean, there had to be something. So to me, actually, this is very satisfying. Just one clarification and one question. The question is, I'm not sure by adding the empowerment lens, what are we adding to the debate if we are already asking the growth question, right? Because the growth ambition of, let's say, India at 8, 9, and we have Mr. Aluwali and Dr. Mohan, right? Those plans and the growth objectives are keeping some societal objectives in mind with respect to poverty, empowerment, etc., right? So aren't those already embedded? So if you can grow fast, meet your growth ambition with climate change transition, is that not good enough? So that is just one question. And one clarification is, maybe I missed, but what are the key levers that are needed from the base case to the accelerated case?
Yep.
Thanks.
I'll pick up from you. I'm sure we'll not cover it. First, the institutional is, of course, obvious. Without institutional frameworks on this, my country used to have 128 people looking after the economic integration of the energy system, and that it worked physically and that everything was ready. And at the moment, that's much less, strangely enough, while the challenge is larger. So lots of these institutional knowledge base and so on do not exist, which actually means that these puzzles are not easy to plan in a way. So I think the call out institutional mechanisms for permitting, institutional mechanisms for rule setting, and all. I mean, there's a lot of stuff if you want to solve this question for real that you have to do. To me, whether if you have them or not is actually a test whether you're serious. Because if you don't have them, it's not going to work. We are running a shortage for chargers. We're running out of shortage for this. This doesn't work. That can't be installed, which is just like a world catching up. Now, the real reality why that is the last 10 years of transformation was very slow. We added 1 or 2% renewable energy capacity of the total energy mix over a decade, which is 0.15 per year. For the next 30 years, doing the remaining 90 is a 20 times faster rate. And then these problems of institution become super important. Just want to say this. I actually think the empowerment thing is far more fundamental than your suggestion. And it's for 3 reasons. If you forget the empowerment, we could easily say, please all meet 2050, and then go to sub-Saharan Africa or India and say, just pay for it. And it doesn't matter what it does to the empowerment of the people in India and South Africa. That's, of course, the discussion on North-South on climate. because the transition is very expensive, capex intense, cash intense, materials intense, innovation intense. And one of the inequities actually to talk about is that you have economies that have developed already and economies that need to develop, where the burden as a percentage of GDP is completely skewed if you were to just say, go do it. And not taking the empowerment conversation into account, actually, and we think the empowerment discussion is an elegant way to not just talk about financial transfers, about climate money, but to actually talk about why you do that. The why of the transfers is only a climate why. So if you say, the North, let's pay this much to the South in whatever funds, that's a climate why. The real why is the development of these countries. And not discussing that these countries should develop to a much higher next level is actually, there are models that I've read which basically assume that the South does not grow to solve climate. I'm serious. And so that, to me, making it explicit that we are trying to solve a world of broad-based prosperity for a broad-based sense of humanity with this other 4.8 billion people is essential to this conversation to keep it balanced. And just the growth sustainability discussion is not enough for that, because the sustainability discussion itself can be incredibly inequitable across geography. There's other inequities that go into that, which I very much agree with. Yeah, I actually like that we say that it's not solved, because I actually think the world needs to realize it's not solved. If it were solved, we would have done it already. The transformation speed of the last decade shows you this is not solved. And many people say, okay, let's just get on with it. Okay, what did you exactly mean? Which of these things that we discussed did you mean, let's just get on with it? Where's that train going to go? Where is that train going to end? To me, is a very fundamental question. And if we don't raise it collectively, we've had episodes in our economic history where the train goes off track because we just get on with it. I don't think that's responsible.
I'll take the specific question on the empowerment threshold and just address that in terms of how we did it. So what we showed you in terms of the mix is meant to be illustrative. We didn't focus on the mix in a bottom-up sense to say, okay, line item by line item, what does it cost? We drew on a few different sources of literature, research, and data to build this. So one fundamental concept was this idea of $12 PPP per person per day being the threshold that's sufficient to allow or minimize or reduce the vulnerability of slipping back into poverty. And that's established in one body of academic literature, enough to meet sufficient needs and start being able to save and have a little bit of discretionary consumption. So there is sort of one body of literature that supports the $12. Then there's another body of literature that suggests very strongly that this threshold does depend on societal considerations, cost of living, what local services might cost in different parts of the world, and also real norms might actually be different. A cold country requires heating, a warm country may not. So costs do differ based on that as well. We also leveraged wage indicator data. Wage indicator is a large database spanning 100 plus countries where they sample cost of living based on all the elements for different locations within countries and come up with a sort of level which the better performing or the more responsible companies then think about, right, as an input to their wage setting strategies. And that's actually broken up line item by line item. So we calibrate the $12 PPP floor. For higher income countries, we looked at wage data. And then we also calibrated the $12 with wage data for lower income countries to make sure that that total made sense. But we're not normative about the composition. We looked at this fascinating database called Gapminder, which has these actual photographs of real life people. And we said for somebody, for example, in Nigeria who lives at the empowerment line, that family had a car that was in their photo. But the wage indicator data only had budgeted for, I think, two-wheelers. So that's a choice that household has made. And it's not our business to recommend whether that choice is valid or not. It's just one example of saying it's an overall level that gives the household choices about how they want to spend their money.
Thanks. Questions? Sharath? Michael, it's being recorded, so you need a mic. It's being recorded but not zoomed, but it will be zoomed once we zoom it.
Thank you. Wonderful presentation. I think the one thing which I took back, a couple of things that I took back, I have a question on that, is that I think it was the Engel's law which said that if your household income is like you're spending 50% of your income on food, then you're poor. I think this number shows 44.4%. I think
It's pretty close.
yeah. So my point is, I just want to make sure whether I understood this correctly. You have two gaps that you present, an empowerment gap and the net zero gap. My point is, why didn't you look that together as a whole? Because I'm sure there's a lot of cross-pollination, because I'm sure the empowerment gap is also going to fill up here. It's going to talk to the net zero gap. So, but why the segregation part? Why not as a whole? And you can make the double circular, whatever form of showing graph and all that.
But from a systems perspective, that's what we did. But the growth is actually what fills up the empowerment. The empowerment and the growth add to the sustainability footprint.
Okay,
We just wanted to make sure that there are two stories to tell. We're trying to solve
I see. Okay, so the whole
climate.
thing.
This thing is an integrated model. The integration of these models can get much better. I would say most macroeconomic models that we look at and even climate models are not fully balanced across all these dimensions. So to me, this opened also this discussion a bit more, that our model should get better at integrating all these linkages. I said that one of our papers tees up 15 of these linkages. We haven't modeled all 15 in this work.
Okay.
But I would welcome a much more decent modeling of these things, where these interactions, and there's just the interaction of my experience in the Netherlands. Once you get rich, you can clean the Rhine, is actually an important interaction. Also, there's just a threshold level below which people are not going to spend political time on this issue.
So let me understand this. That was modeled it together.
Yeah.
Everything was modeled together.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Questions? Any more? You're exhausted? Good. So Montek, all yours for final comments. In fact, you can even ask questions if you feel like. Or maybe you could start with the questions and then whatever you like.
Sorry,
I don't think I need to introduce you.
no, yeah, that's a waste of time. But you want me to ask questions? You want me to ask comments?
Up to you. Up to you.
No, I think I'll just make some comments. I mean, well, first of all, I share everybody's view that it's a very short paper, but it does raise to my mind a lot of the relevant questions. And if you've looked at the other literature which is floating around, different estimates of what it costs and so on, it is in the mainstream. It's not inconsistent with, what Nick Stern and Songway have done, and also I think what the NK Singh, Larry Summers people are doing, in terms of what it's going to cost. But I wonder what, and by the way, I totally agree with this business of broadening the concept to empowerment. Because, by definition, if you adopt the fixed poverty line, then sooner or later poverty declines. But that doesn't suit anybody, actually. It certainly does not suit the politicians, because you cannot sort of say, I am concerned about the poor, who are only 4.5% of the population. I mean, the moment you say that, then the chap will say, look, I'm not just concerned. I'm concerned about a broader number of people. So I either redefine that by saying the bottom 40% are always poor, which is what was done, way back in 1970 or something in the World Bank. Or you can go the German route and say whoever's at 30% of the mean consumption of the country or below is poor. But it's sort of a combination of an absolute and relative. I think the most important thing you have to remember is, I think I'm right. Jesus Christ is reported to have said, blessed are the poor, for they are always with us. And from a political point of view, that is what the politicians mean when they say they're pro-poor, because they're always with us. Now, if somebody were to pull the guy's sleeve and say, by the way, they're only 2%, he would say, that's rubbish, right? So I think the whatever you call it, empowerment, good thing. I also agree that, a certain amount of spillover benefit will come from the normal growth. And then you say this humongous net zero business poses an additional challenge, and then you quantify it. And I think your quantifications are more or less in line with what others have done. And I don't mean to denigrate you, I'm just complimenting you. Because I think when politicians find there are 6 different studies, and somebody says, McKinsey have a study, first thing people will ask is, by the way, are they saying something very different? Because if they are, then it's controversial. Then no, it's a different way of doing things, but just saying numbers are similar. I think that's useful. But what I find, first of all, there was a time when I used to worry about global patterns. I don't worry about them at all. So I'm focusing entirely on India. This is, understandably, you're going to the B20. So you're talking about the whole world. Now, mind you, we're quite a large part of the relevant world. So it's quite fair for us to say, what does it mean for India? And there, I personally feel that what we are missing, I don't mean you, but all of us, and even in the other studies, we don't have studies, we have studies that give a rather comfortable and internally rational picture. And by that I mean that, look, got to have more growth, you need more mitigation effort, maybe some adaptation. That means more investment. How much more investment depends on innovation, productivity. In none of these things will anyone disagree. The real question, though, is that, by the way, if you think so, are you willing to do A, B, C, D? And at least in the Indian context, that's what I'm focusing on. And I find that whenever you make anything specific to highlight the difficult choice, people say, hang on a minute, I'm entirely in favor of green growth, but I never said I'm in favor of this and that and the other. I think you had a throwaway line. It's an interesting line because you said you don't want to emphasize the role of prices because prices go against empowerment. Now, I mean, I guess that means that there's a recent IMF paper that has literally just come out a couple of days ago, which says that, the global extent of subsidy, I mean, the explicit subsidy is at 2% of GDP. Now, the first question that will come up, anyone trying to collect money, people are going to say, well, look, you want 2%, you want 4%, or whatever it is from the world. Why don't you just get 2% by getting rid of all your subsidies? And immediately you lose all political support within the country from all political parties. How do you handle that in practice? I mean, I don't have an answer. But I think we in our internal thinking, we need to be clear. Even amongst academics, even in research institutions, you will not get support for the proposition that if you want to handle this problem, you have to affect prices. Now, that's economics 101. I mean, why are we bothered about cutting fossil fuels? And why isn't it happening automatically? It's because the price of fossil fuels doesn't reflect the costs they impose on the society. And if you go around any group and say, let us endorse the following proposition. In India, the proposition we use, which is the core of our environment policy, is the polluter must pay. I mean, most people don't know that it's there, but that's what it says. Now, if you're going to say the polluter must pay, then, for the world as a whole, the implicit subsidy, that is the difference between the retail price and what would, in fact, internalize all these costs, if I remember, is about 5% of GDP. Now, that's humongous. So do we think, that's the first question, whatever you want to do we think that we can bring about a change and make no difference whatsoever to the pricing issue? I personally think no. And secondly, when you're thinking about, environment, thinking about mitigation versus adaptation, I mean, it's pretty clear that, particularly for a country that is now at the bottom of the middle income group, I mean, we are not low income anymore. Nobody will be willing to pay for adaptation for India because the benefits of adaptation are entirely internal. So they'll say, well, look, the benefits are there, why don't you pay for them? So in terms of the internal, if you like, allocation of resources, there will be a tendency to give more weight to adaptation and less weight to mitigation.
Yeah.
Second, I can go on and on, but I think I've made my point. I don't know what the solution is, but it's a different point that I wanted to make. You made the point, very good point, I think, that a lot of the changes that are necessary are actually, I think, as you call it, in the money. In other words, the market will do it. Now, how many of these changes are in the money without the pricing being resolved? That's point number one. Point number two, particularly in India, since, I think somewhere you say that the big thing that needs to be done, at least in the next 10 years, is power going renewable and the mobility going electric. Agreed totally. Now, in the mobility going electric, at the moment is not in the money. China has got 29% of its passenger cars electric. India has 1%. Our target setters frequently say we have a target of 30% by 2030. But the present position is that even for two-wheelers, it's only 4%. Now, I agree, it can shoot up quite a lot. So I think, and of course, what the industry is saying is, look, if you want all this, give us more subsidies. So we have the FAME 1 scheme, we have the FAME 2 scheme, which is about to end, and lobbying has already begun to start a FAME 3 scheme. So we're being pushed into a situation where we can't use prices to raise resources or discourage the wrong choice, but we're being pushed into a situation where we must subsidize from the budget in order to encourage the right choice. Fiscally, this is simply not going to be sustainable. So what do? I think I'm not suggesting that you should address these issues here. Certainly not in a celebratory occasion like the B20. But based on your paper, I think somebody has to say, I think they had this in mind and we should think about it. Yeah. And to my mind, one of the biggest problems is that we want to move away from coal-fired, coal-based thermal generation to renewables, solar and wind. Wonderful. That is massively more capital intensive because it doesn't use any the raw material, as it were, is free. And we want it to come from the private sector. That's also wonderful because otherwise we don't have the money. And we want to electrify the system. So the demand for electricity is going to move faster than it did in the past. And we're going to do all this in a situation where the distribution companies are broke. Now, I'm not saying, by the way, that there's anything inherent in Indian culture that our distribution companies should be broke. But before we go to Dubai and all these places, we should have a plan. What is going to make the Indian distribution companies not broke? If you don't have a plan, you don't have a plan.
Exactly.
So I think these are the things I feel that in the current debate, if you collect a group of 100 people who are in India, I'm only talking about India, but probably much better elsewhere. If you collect a group of 100 people who are agitated about climate change, and you ask them, these are the targets we want, do you agree? They absolutely agree. But if you raise a number of difficult things that they have to do, complete lack, not only lack of agreement, but not even the preliminary discussions on whether X is right or Y. And for example, how about privatizing distribution? Not thought about, not talkable about, and I'm not talking about the central government. This is a purely state government matter. No state chief minister is willing to do this. So frankly, I feel that before we start demanding huge sums of money from the rest of the world, which, I mean, I share the view, quite honestly, the world is being very frank, and they've made it quite plain that at least in the next couple of years, don't expect anything. So we should be planning on the assumption that we will be going to these conferences and working hard to find a form or phrase that is acceptable, and they'll be quite good at it, but don't expect any money to come. In that case, what should we be doing? Personally, I think in the next 3-4 years, we should be doing whatever is necessary to make all the investments which are in the money, potentially, actually doable. Now, I think it'd be a good idea, in case you're meeting the Prime Minister or someone, to give him privately a list of these 6 things.
So just a quick reaction. First of all,
sorry, if you want to respond, I'm delighted.
No. I give you two responses. First of all,
have you finished or?
that is the first. No, in the beauty of conversation, first of all, I will remember forever from this conversation that there's a far better argument for empowerment, which is Jesus Christ and politicians. Politicians need 60% buckets, which is, by the way, of course, right, because politicians need to stand for the people and empowerment stands for the people and not just extreme poverty. So I'm fully with you on that. I think the other thing on price, and maybe I didn't say this explicitly, and you did it in many beautiful ways, there is ample research that says the following: under consumers in rich and poor countries. You ask them, what is your top 1, 2, 3 priority? They will put economy, job, life, health, climate change. It's in the top 3. You add $1 per month in a rich country, it drops below 20. Yeah, it's not a priority in that sense. So the price, and that's why the politicians say it's nice that, Nobel Prize winners say you should put a price on it, which is totally logical because it's an externality and blah, 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 blah. But the price is so high that you can't solve it. That means, in my view, my program would be very simple for India: do the Indian money and make the Indian money bigger, which is some part facilitation of infrastructure ABCD, but it's also partially stimulate the innovation. I actually kind of would triple down on the IRA type stuff, not the IRA precisely, but what's the IRA equivalent for India? The subsidy of 300 billion to produce innovation that takes $1 trillion of the cost is far more productive than deploying stuff now that the people can't nor are willing and are not willing to pay for. So, and I think we are trying to, maybe it's too soft still, to your point, keep raising the bar on this discussion. We had a report on net zero 2 years ago that said this is this much of a step up, and people were already saying you can't say that, which actually made the investment levels transparent. Then this was in line with what others were starting to say. So the world is starting to come to grips. Why is that? The last 10 years was a 0.15 per year experiment. You don't notice. But once you do 3% per year for the whole world, you're going to meet it in lithium, you're going to meet it in steel, you're going to meet it in infrastructure, in the distribution companies, in the regulation. And all of a sudden, you're doing a real transformation. The last decade was not a transformation, it was an experiment of 0.15 a year. The real transformation in 30 years is 3%. It's 20 times faster than what we did the last 10 years. Then the rubber starts to hit the road. This thing suggests this is how big the rubber is. But I'm fully with you. We need to start transacting the ABCD. And that might have to include more adaptation because we will not get full mitigation at this cost done. And one thing to your point that we don't not do something. So for COP, we are actually doing a transition curve for the whole world, country by country, that says, can you make this thing half the price?
I'd like to see the India one, actually.
Can we make this half the price? So do the easy stuff first.
Yep.
Do the innovation first to bring the cost down. And is that possible? The first calculations look at it, it could be cheaper, and there's different buckets. Mm-hmm. But we need to do the work to make this transition cheaper if you want to do this with the empowerment so that people are willing to pay the price. But I will not forget, we need 60% of the people to buy.
Comment attributing this sentiment to Jesus Christ is due to Michael Lipton.
Okay.
Way back in the World Bank in 1968 or something.
Okay.
So that's how old it is.
Fantastic.
A little younger than Jesus Christ.
Huh?
But thank you.
Than Jesus Christ.
It was a privilege to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jesus Christ or Montek?
Both. And your whole group.
Where is it?
Thank you. Just remains for me to say thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very
Do
much,
send it to me.
Anu, Sven, Montek, Lavish, Renu, for this really very, very engaging discussion. Just, I think, two things I hope you can carry away from here, from what our commentators said. One is pricing, just focus more on pricing, even though it may be unpopular. But to some extent, the question is there an alternative? And the other thing I would say is, if I can gather from what Montek, Lavish, and Renu said, more on how.
Yep, sure.
And you got the what, more on how.
Yep.
And what you just said, that, look, these things can be done. And finally, one comment from me that on the mitigation adaptation issue, as far as India is concerned, being a large emitter, we will have to do both mitigation and adaptation. And the question is, what's the sequence, or do it together, how much, and so on. Finally, Montek talked about B20 celebratory occasion. You should have been there this morning to really get a sense of the celebratory occasion at the B20. Incredible celebration.
Yes.
Incredible celebration, as if the world really conquered everything in the world. So,
And in particular India, by the way.
particularly India, actually. So, Bas, thank you very much. Really, it is really privilege for us to have you here, and especially in a preview of what will be released at 11:30 tomorrow to the rest of the world, actually. Thank you very much.
More to come. Thank you.